The line that built a nation. Sweat, steel, and the untold history of the Transcontinental Railroad. Did you know that the greatest engineering feat in 19th century America, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, was not just a triumph of steam and iron, but a desperate race against time, powered by Civil War veterans, Irish immigrants, and thousands of invisible Chinese laborers whose sweat equity was literally written out of the history books? Forget the golden spike. This is the true story of the steel line that tore through a continent, created a modern America, and cost an unimaginable human toll. The year is 1863. America is tearing itself apart. The brutal, agonizing tragedy of the Civil War rages across the eastern and southern states, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. Yet even as the Union fought for its very survival, a group of visionary and largely self-interested men in Washington, D.C., pushed through an act of Congress that would change the map of the world forever, the Pacific Railway Act. It was a desperate, audacious gamble to connect a burgeoning industrial East with the almost mythic wealth of the newly minted state of California and the vast, untamed West. The goal? A continuous iron line of track from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean, a physical ribbon that would bind a fractured nation and realize the dream of manifest destiny. This was more than an infrastructure project. It was a race, a colossal financial scheme, and an existential challenge to the very limits of human engineering. Two companies were chartered for this epic task. From the east, starting in Omaha, Nebraska, the Union Pacific Railroad would charge west across the Great Plains. From the west, starting in Sacramento, California, the Central Pacific Railroad would face the nearly insurmountable obstacle of the Sierra Nevada mountains. The financial and political stakes were astronomical. Congress offered not just massive government loans, but also 10 square miles of public land for every mile of track laid. The more track, the more land, the more profit. The race was on, and the land itself was the prize. The Central Pacific's impossibility, the Sierra Nevada. For the Central Pacific, the challenge was immediate and terrifying. The four men who formed the company's core, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, collectively known as the Big Four, were all merchants, not railroad men. They hired Theodore Judah, a brilliant but chronically underestimated engineer, to find the route. Judah, a man with railroad fever in his veins, had already surveyed a feasible, if harrowing, path through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. He found the key, the infamous Donner Pass. The initial work was laughably slow. Starting in January 1863, progress was measured in feet, not miles. The first major hurdle was the sheer scale of the labor needed. Where would the Central Pacific find the thousands of strong men needed to blast and carve a path through solid granite hundreds of miles from any major city? Initially, Crocker, the general contractor, tried to hire white laborers, mostly Irish and European immigrants who had settled in California during the gold rush. But these men were independent, often deserting for the perceived greener pastures of the latest mining boom. They were demanding, prone to fighting, and utterly unsuited for the relentless, brutal monotony of railroad work. Crocker famously complained that he couldn't keep more than 800 men on the payroll at any one time. In a fit of frustrated desperation, his superintendent, James Strybridge, scoffed at a suggestion to hire Chinese laborers, saying they were too small and physically weak for such heavy, dangerous work. Crocker, however, was a man of cold calculation, not prejudice. He saw the logic of a large, reliable labor pool. In the spring of 1865, he forced the issue. He hired 50 Chinese men as an experiment. They proved to be meticulously organized, incredibly diligent, and most importantly, they stayed on the job. The experiment became policy. By 1867, the Central Pacific employed 12,000 Chinese laborers, making up roughly 90% of their workforce. These men, many of whom had been driven from their homes by economic hardship in China, arrived in America seeking Gold Mountain, but found only the brutal reality of the Iron Road. They were paid less than their white counterparts, about $31 a month without board, compared to $35 with board for white workers, and they were given the most dangerous and difficult tasks. Their work in the Sierra Nevada was a masterpiece of human endurance. They tunneled through solid rock, hanging from cliffs in woven baskets, to chip, drill, and blast the granite with unstable nitroglycerin and black powder. They faced not only the sheer brutality of the rock, but also the inhuman winters of the Sierra Nevada.
The winter of 1866-1867 was legendary. Snowfall was recorded at over 40 feet. The workers had to live in tunnels dug into the snow, working on the track line beneath a blanket of white. They worked by lantern light, sometimes for weeks on end, without seeing the sun. Avalanches were a constant, silent killer. In one section, it's estimated that at least 1,000 men were buried alive by snowslides, their bodies only recovered when the spring thaw arrived. The Central Pacific kept shockingly poor records of the Chinese dead, but historians estimate that anywhere from 1,200 to 2,000 Chinese lives were lost building the western half of the line. The greatest triumph of the Central Pacific, powered by Chinese muscle and ingenuity, was the Summit Tunnel. It was a 1,659-foot bore through the granite crest of Donner Pass. The Chinese laborers invented techniques to speed up the process, including drilling from 4 different faces by digging vertical shafts, known as pioneer tunnels, to allow work from the center out. This was a method not common in American engineering at the time, demonstrating their practical brilliance under duress. When the Central Pacific finally broke through the mountains in late 1867, the path was clear. The line could now race across the Nevada desert. The monumental achievement, a direct result of the Chinese workers' sacrifice, was barely acknowledged in the press. The story was still dominated by the white, heroic narrative of conquest. The Union Pacific's Wild West, the Great Plains. Meanwhile, the Union Pacific, beginning in Omaha, faced a different but equally daunting set of challenges. Their progress started much later, partly due to political squabbles and the instability of the Civil War. Unlike the Central Pacific, the Union Pacific had relatively flat ground to cover, the vast, featureless expanse of the Great Plains. The challenge here was one of scale, logistics, and danger. The Union Pacific's workforce was a kaleidoscope of post-Civil War America. Thousands of Irish immigrants, often derisively called paddies, many of whom had just finished digging canals or toiling in eastern factories, and a huge contingent of Civil War veterans from both the Union and Confederate armies, seeking employment and escape from their battlefield trauma. This was a tough, often violent crew, hardened by war and poverty. The construction camps known as Hell on Wheels were legendary for their lawlessness. As the track moved, so did the makeshift towns that followed the workers. These were temporary oases of vice and chaos, supplying the men with liquor and distractions. Violence was endemic, a lethal mix of boredom, alcohol, and the constant presence of firearms. Historians estimate that in a single year, the notorious town of Julesburg, Nebraska, saw 60 murders. The construction line was a frontier without law. The other great peril for the Union Pacific was the Native American tribes whose land they were brazenly trespassing on. For the Plains tribes, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the railroad was an existential threat, not just to their life of way, but to the very ecosystem they depended on. The steel tracks sliced through their ancestral hunting grounds and, most critically, spelled the doom of the buffalo. The railroad hired professional hunters, most famously Buffalo Bill Cody, to supply the workers with meat. These hunters decimated the herds, a deliberate strategy to starve the tribes into submission or force them onto reservations. The tribes retaliated by attacking work crews, derailing trains, and stealing supplies. The railroad became a paramilitary operation. The Union Pacific armed its workers with rifles and hired former soldiers to guard the line. The conflict became a microcosm of the larger Indian Wars, a brutal, often one-sided conflict between the march of industrial progress and the defense of a vanishing world. Thousands of miles of rail were laid under the shadow of continuous, lethal skirmishes. The Union Pacific's speed was unprecedented. Once they hit the flat plains, they developed a system of construction that was part factory, part military march. Teams of men developed a rhythm. Graders prepared the roadbed, followed by bridge builders, then the rail-laying teams. The final elite group could lay up to 2 miles of track a day in the spring of 1868, pushing their bodies to the absolute limit. Leading the charge for the Union Pacific was General Grenville M. Dodge, a seasoned Civil War officer and brilliant engineer, and Thomas C. Durant, the vice president, a ruthless financier who was simultaneously running one of the greatest corporate scandals in American history, Credit Mobile. The Great Scandal, Credit Mobile. While thousands of men risked their lives for $1 to $3 a day, the men at the top were executing a massive scheme of corruption that would later rock the foundations of American politics. Thomas Durant created a separate construction company called Credit Mobile of America. The Union Pacific then hired Credit Mobile to do the actual construction work at grossly inflated costs. The profits from this scam went directly into the pockets of Durant and his associates, essentially enriching themselves by paying themselves with government money. To keep the government from investigating, Durant and his partners sold or gave shares of Credit Mobile stock to influential congressmen and government officials at very low prices. This effectively bought their silence and their votes. The scandal was eventually exposed in 1872, revealing a web of corruption that implicated the Vice President of the United States, Schuyler Colfax, and numerous other prominent politicians. The railroad was built not just with steel and sweat, but with outright theft and political bribery, illustrating the dark side of America's post-Civil War industrial boom.
The final race and the golden spike. By the spring of 1869, the two lines were approaching each other across the Utah Territory. The financial incentives of the land grants meant neither company wanted to stop laying track, even as they passed one another. They were building parallel lines, wasting materials and money, until Congress finally intervened and set a specific meeting point, Promontory Summit, Utah. The final weeks were a desperate frenzy. Crocker, determined to win a wager against Dodge for which company could lay the most track in a single day, rallied his Chinese work crews. On April 28, 1869, under the constant prodding of their bosses, a team of Irish and Chinese laborers for the Central Pacific performed the Great Feat, laying 10 miles and 56 feet of track in a single day, a record that has never been broken. The work was a mesmerizing ballet of sheer force. As described by witness, a carload of rails, 560 rails, 3,500 pounds each, was put down in 80 seconds. 8 Irishmen grabbed the rails, 2 to a rail, and in 30 seconds they were in their place. This record was a testament not to the machines, but to the incredible human power driving the project. The Chinese crews did the final work, aligning the track, setting the spikes, and tamping the ballast, all with breathtaking precision and speed. The lines met at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869. The ceremony was chaotic and anticlimactic. 2 locomotives, the Union Pacific's Jupiter and the Central Pacific's number 1119, faced nose to nose across a single gap in the track. VIPs and photographers had traveled hundreds of miles. Leland Stanford was given the honor of tapping in the final ceremonial golden spike. The moment was a technical disaster. Stanford swung the silver maul, missed the spike entirely, and hit the tie. But the telegraph operator was ready. The prearranged signal, ... was sent, and the message flashed across the country, "Done." Bells rang out in San Francisco and New York. The nation had been physically united. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. The great American interior was now open to settlement, commerce, and relentless exploitation. Travel time from New York to California was slashed from 6 months to about a single week. The aftermath, the price of progress. The true, deep story of the Transcontinental Railroad doesn't end with the Golden Spike. The consequences were immediate, revolutionary, and often devastating. The fate of the Native Americans. The railroad was the spearhead of the final destruction of the Plains tribes' sovereignty. Within 2 decades, the buffalo herds were virtually extinct, deliberately eliminated to clear the way for settlers and ranchers. The federal government used the railroad as a primary tool for troop deployment and supply during the final bloody campaigns of the Indian Wars. The dream of manifest destiny was achieved on a foundation of broken treaties and cultural genocide. The Chinese exclusion. The great, nearly forgotten tragedy is the fate of the 12,000 Chinese workers. Once their work was complete, they were immediately dismissed. They dispersed across the West looking for work in mining, fishing, and agriculture, but they were no longer seen as necessary labor. They were viewed as economic competition. The very politicians and industries that had profited immensely from their labor soon championed anti-Chinese sentiment. This eventually led to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major federal laws to restrict immigration entirely based on nationality, effectively banning all Chinese laborers from entering the country for a decade, and setting a precedent for xenophobic immigration policy that would last for decades. The men who had literally built the physical link of the nation were shut out of the society they helped create. The economic revolution launched the United States into an unprecedented era of industrial and economic growth. The nation became a single unified market. Chicago became the world's meatpacking center. California's citrus and produce could reach Eastern tables in days, and American steel and timber industries boomed. The great western cities, Denver, Sacramento, San Francisco, exploded in size. The railroad created wealth, but it also created the great American monopolies, setting the stage for the political battles of the Gilded Age. The Transcontinental Railroad is a true story of staggering ambition, incredible engineering, profound corruption, and the forgotten sacrifice of thousands. It is the story of how America, amidst its darkest hour, forged its future with blood and iron. A feat that defined the scale, scope, and often brutal character of the modern American enterprise. The line is more than a historical artifact. It is a permanent scar and a magnificent testament to the relentless, often unacknowledged, power of human labor.